I am with Richard Woods, and he's a catamaran designer and sailor, and we are talking about various elements of what to look for when you're looking for a catamaran. And one of the things that obviously comes up fairly early on is the age of a boat and whether or not your fiberglass wears out, or what to keep in mind when you're looking at an older boat, I guess, specifically. So Richard, let's dive into catamaran age. What kind of ages do cats come in? I always think of them as sort of a newer type of boat. So how old are the production catamarans? How far do they go back?
Oh, much. We actually own a catamaran that was built in 1977 as a production boat. It's not one of my designs, but they do go back to the mid-1950s. And I've always said that a wooden boat lasts a lifetime and a fiberglass boat will last forever.
So I guess there's something to be said for looking at older boats and maintaining them. But so let's talk a little bit about what, if you are thinking about older boats, are there things that you should be really aware of?
Well, again, this is one of the places where it doesn't matter whether you're looking at a monohull or a multi-hull, by and large, because the fiberglass is fiberglass. One of the things I would be very careful about doing is buying a boat with a balsa cord deck that was more than 20 years old, unless you actually do a very careful survey of the deck, because it's so prone to rot through deck fittings, chain plates, anchor cleats, that sort of thing. And so for choice, I would avoid a balsa boat, and I would much prefer a foam sandwich boat. Having said that, of course, this boat, our 50-year-old boat, is 45 years old, is balsa cord, but I did go over it very, very carefully, and there was no delamination, partly because it's very, very heavily built. And that's one of the factors like with the monohulls, is that a lot of the early boats were overbuilt because people didn't realize quite how strong fiberglass was. And a lot of the earliest boats were built in chop strand mat, solid glass. And that's much weaker than the more modern material. So one of the advantages of a more modern boat, say from maybe the mid-80s, 1990 onwards, where pretty much all were built with what they call non-crimp glass, so biaxial and quadraxial glass. So it all sounds very fancy, but it basically means that it's two flat layers of glass laid one on top of the other instead of a woven one. And so that's a big advantage as far as the hull structure is concerned. But then, as I say, that's going to essentially last forever. So what you have to look at is the rig, the engines, and the general interior fit out. And sails, you could probably, people do sail around with sails that are 20 years old, but you've got to assume that you're going to get new sails when you buy a used boat. The boat in the picture behind me there is our 34-foot Romany catamaran, and we bought that from the third owner. But the first thing we did was to buy new sails, and we had Dave Calvert make fantastic sails, best sails I've ever had, and I strongly recommend having sails made by him. And they just looked so good. And that's essentially, it's a sailing boat, so you've got to get your engine right, tune your engine. So when you're buying a second-hand boat, assume you're going to spend good money on sales. Cheap sales, they're not worth it.
Right.
Term. They're just not worth it. They're usually badly cut and then cheaply made. And we've gone through that with cheap Hong Kong, Southeast Asian sales last year. And so that's actually something when you're buying even a new boat, to find out who's making the sales and pay the extra. I would always pay the extra for new sales, for better sales. Then it's the same with the engines, that if you've got an outboard, it's easy because it's easy to change and easy to take ashore and get the mechanic to take the engine to the mechanic instead of the other way around. But you need to check the engine hours and not just, and then find out whether the engine's being used to charge the batteries, because that's not good because the engines and diesel engines need to be run at load, and you run them fast and lightly loaded, it's not good for the engine. So you need to check whether it's got a separate generator, or these days whether you've got enough solar panels to keep the boat running. And then the rig, if it's over about 10 years, you probably may want to change the 3 main shrouds, assuming you've got a fractional rig boat. The Darmans are usually okay because they don't flex around, but the forestay and the main shrouds wobble to and fro, and so they tend to fatigue. And then the general spars, checking for corrosion, same as you would with any other boat. And deck gear, the same. See if the winches spin, see if the main sheet traveller goes to and fro easily. One of the other things that is important to find out with a multi-hull as opposed to a monohull, you've got to generally have a much bigger mainsail. With battens, fully battened sail, the loads on the batten push forwards into the mast, which is why it's much harder to hoist a mainsail with a fully battened mainsail than with a big roach, which is another factor that we may well be talking about at another time. Right. But to see, you want to try getting the mainsail up and down, even if you're on shore or something, because you want to check that it's got easy running slides or ball bearing cars. And then when you get into the inside, if you're buying an old charter boat, it's going to be really hammered inside because it's going to have been used so much. It may not have sailed much, and the engines may not have been used much, but the water pump and the upholstery and all those, and the toilets heads are all going to be very badly worn. And by people, it's like when you rent a car, you go over a bump and you don't care. Well, right. That's not my car. So you charter a boat. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. Oh, no, I'll leave the pump running. Oh, it's sucking air. Well, so what? It's not my pump that's wearing out.
Right.
And so you've got to be, even a 5-year-old boat, ex-charter boat, which seems to be about the time that they come out of charter after 5 years. They may have a 10-year, the equivalent of 10 years use. And just on that, one of the things that I would never, ever, ever do as a customer is buy a boat show boat.
Okay.
For 2 reasons. One is, if you buy a regular boat, it's going to be, the delivery is going to be late. It can never be late with a boat show boat because the boat shows are set up.
Right.
So everyone's going to be rushing it. It's like these home improvement TV shows where they've got to do it in the week or the weekend because, whatever. So that's one reason that so a boat show boat is going to be rushed. And the other is you're going to have 1,000 people walking all over it, and it's going to be wrecked before you even got it. So I wouldn't have a showboat.
So one of the things that I'm thinking about as you're speaking is with monohulls, there was definitely different ages in when they were built. There was sort of the era where a lot of boats were built in Taiwan and that kind of area. And then sort of some of the more modern builds that are much, much lighter weight. Did catamarans go through that same kind of evolution where there's different styles and different types of build? Or are they more unique than that, more one-off per brand?
Well, obviously the main, when multi-hull started, the bulk of the production boats were built in England until about 1975.
Okay.
About Cadillac, Solaris, Sailcraft. They built hundreds of boats long before any boat was built in the US, for example, and before the French started building boats either. And now they're mainly built in France, South Africa, and Southeast Asia. The ones, even the big ones that were yards that were building in Australia, moved to where labor's cheaper, which is Vietnam, I think.
So do you know, like boats built in different countries, does it matter that much? Like I imagine English boats, you're an Englishman, so are they a better built boat, the ones that were built in England, or does that really matter as much?
Oh, well, that's another factor actually for Americans looking at European boats, is that the shore power is 240 volt, 50 hertz, and you're 110, 60 hertz. So even when you get an inverter, you might be going from 50 to 60 hertz, and your washing machine doesn't work, for example, because it's a synchronous motor which works on cycles rather than. So that's one factor to think about is, whether your boat equipment is going to match. And the wiring is different colors, and the general electrical systems, propane systems might be different. So if you're buying a new boat from a yard in France or South Africa, they already know, they presume, and they'll have a US spec and a European spec. But buying an older boat, again, you need to be careful about that. And then the other thing is that it's not just the building, it's the design as well. And as you know from the IOR had a huge influence on monohull design right through the 70s up to, say, the mid-80s. And at the same time, multi-hulls were developing very quickly. And the early multi-hulls were experimental. I started multi-hull sailing and designing in the mid-70s. And in 1976, there was a multi-hull magazine did a multi-hull symposium. And I always, where they had a lot of people and all the designers met up in Annapolis, I think. And I always think that was a watershed changeover. Before 1976, the multi-hull sailors were sort of the lunatic fringe, and after that they became conventional. And now more and more, everyone's buying a multi-hull. And but there's less real information. The best books that people have written are all, even the newest are something like maybe 15 years old. And maybe books are no longer what people use for information, and they go to little interviews with people instead to learn about boats. Um, but off the subject.
No, that's interesting though. So design of multi-hulls has a, because that is something that people like to look at in boats, is just sort of how modern the design is. So would you say design has not really made a lot of great leaps since those initial ones in the early 70s or mid to late 70s? Or is design, obviously it's getting bigger and bulkier and that kind of design change, but what about other aspects?
Well, I've talked about this with other designers in other disciplines. Why do people design something new, and what is it that they're actually doing? And one of the things seems to be that with boats, people want something bigger every time. Not where when you buy a car, initially you buy a cheap little car. And then as you get older and wealthier and whatever, more experienced, you end up buying a Mercedes. You don't buy a stretch limo. You don't buy a car that's longer and bigger. You buy a better car. And that seems to be, when you have you've got your house and you remodel it, you put a new kitchen in, a better quality kitchen. You don't put a bigger kitchen in. And yet with boats, people seem to say, I want a bigger one each time, rather than saying, I want a better one each time. So one of the things that you also should look out for is the quality, because there is a big difference in quality. And a big boat, they're cutting corners somewhere. They have to. And so it's having a smaller boat that's built better is often a good thing to do. The other factor with buying a boat, a new boat in particular, is that the agents make a huge markup, and the advertising and the potted plants and the receptionists and the fingernail polishing and all that stuff. All got to be paid for, and you're paying for it all. And then you're buying a boat that is not necessarily what you want. It's what the boat builder thinks he can sell 1,000 of, which again isn't necessarily a good thing to do. So I always say people should seriously consider having a quality one-off boat build. And that's very common in Australia. There's a lot of people building essentially one-offs as professional builds. In the past, of course, everyone used to build their own boats, but now that's changed.
That's all been really interesting on Boat Age. It kind of, to me, I know a lot of people think about resale value and worry about that when they're looking at the boat is, am I going to be able to sell this when I'm done? And that's why people go for boat names that are familiar and that kind of thing. But what you're saying, the idea that we should be looking for boats that really suit who we are. And if that's a one-off, then there's going to be somebody most likely who'll be looking for that same boat down the road and finding a good quality boat that fits the needs that you have makes an awful lot of sense to me. But thank you, Richard, for that talk on Boat Age.